Hello. In session 5, the input booklet chapter 1, let's focus on the importance of memory. In here, we will cover what research says about how memory works. What you need to do is to listen and answer the questions throughout the presentation. There are two ways of doing this. First of all, you can either print out the handout in the booklet and also do the test yourself first and then check your answers during the presentation, or you can just download it and then check your answers throughout the session. So here, let's start with our first question. Yes, our first memory question is matching the important phrases with their definitions. What do you know about the process of learning new information and keeping it in your memory? Okay. Assuming you have done the quiz and assuming you've done the correct answer, let's look at the answer key. And storage, encoding, short-term memory, retention, and long-term memory are the important phrases related to memory we will cover in this part. Okay, let's start with them one by one. Encoding, storage, and retrieval are three primary stages of memory learning. Therefore, understanding how information is stored in the memory and why certain chunks seem to be stored whereas others are forgotten immediately or never stored is an important concern to all teachers and learners. As demonstrated here, a new word is perceived through the sensory system and then passes permanently to the brain's long-term memory if it is properly processed in the working memory, which is also called short-term memory. But first of all, what happens? We perceive lots of things, lots of new information through our senses. How do we select that? And what do we decide to put in our long-term memory? Here, there are certain things necessary for our memory to recognize something important. First of all, the learner should pay attention to the word and say that that piece of information is important. And then, if they can add some emotions, that means it is worth going to the sensory system. And in the next part, we will talk about all those stages one by one. But I think it is important to clarify the working memory and short-term memory before we continue. Yes, Atkinson and Shiffrin model of memory storage says that the environmental input goes to the sensory memory, and if enough attention is paid, it can go to the short-term memory, and if it is recalled, rehearsed, and retrieved, it may go to long-term memory. Another model, Badley and Teach model of memory, makes a difference between short-term memory and working memory. They say storage is the passive process of retaining information in the memory, sensory, working memory, and long-term memory. Each of these stages of memory has the role of filtering information that helps to protect the brain from unnecessary overload. Studying helps us perform better in tests because the more the information is repeated or used, the more likely it is to be retained in long-term memory. Here you see the difference between short-term memory and long-term memory in terms of their capacity. While short-term memory is limited in capacity, long-term memory seems to be inexhaustible and unlimited to accommodate new information. However, this requires much harder work to commit information to long-term memory because the type of repetition necessary for short-term memory is not enough for long-term memory. As the Atkinson and Shiffrin model of memory storage showed previously, loss of rehearsal or recycling is necessary for the new information to be kept in long-term memory. Badley and Teach talk about the same thing, but they make a difference between working memory and short-term memory. Their studies showed that the concept of short-term memory should be replaced with working memory, as it is argued that all information does not go into one single store. There are different systems for different types of information. Also, the working memory applies to real-life tasks such as reading, which incorporates phonological loop, problem solving that incorporates central executive system, and navigation that incorporates visual and spatial processing. So for the purposes of this session, we will use both models to describe the storage of new vocabulary, and both models are used to understand how information is stored in memory and how we can transfer information into long-term memory. So both working memory and short-term memory will be used interchangeably. Let's look at our next question. Please order the creation of a new memory. What happens to a new word? Yes, as you can see, a new word is perceived through the sensory system. Then it is forgotten if it is not perceived valuable. If it is properly processed in the short-term memory, which is also called working memory, it passes permanently to the brain's long-term memory. However, it is forgotten if not recycled regularly. So this can happen at any stage if adequate recall doesn't exist. So here the order is 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Let's focus on these three stages individually. We will start with encoding first. Encoding is the process of getting information into memory for storage. Encoding allows information to reach our senses in the forms of chemical and physical stimuli. It is the crucial first step to creating a new memory because it allows the perceived item to be converted into a construct that can be stored within the brain and then recalled later from short-term or long-term memory. This process gets information into memory in 4 ways: acoustic encoding, visual encoding, tactile encoding, and semantic encoding. Acoustic encoding is the process of encoding of sound, words, and other auditory inputs for storage and later retrieval. Visual encoding is the process of encoding images and visual sensory information. Tactile encoding is the encoding of how something feels, normally through the sense of touch. Semantic encoding is the process of encoding in which the meaning of something, a word, phrase, picture, event, or whatever, is encoded as opposed to the sound or vision of it. Here are some strategies and techniques that can be used to have long-term encoding, optimal encoding in other words. Using mnemonics, using some techniques for remembering things is particularly useful to memorize simple items or lists of words. Although research does not suggest one particularly effective technique, learners can benefit from finding some type of organization within a group of items. Having a visual element and using the keyword technique and word cards are suggested as useful ones for Thornbury, 2002. But the other researchers suggest associations, chunking, by organizing objects or items into chunks. Learners can turn new items into meaningful wholes, which makes remembering units easier than remembering separate objects. For example, learning words rather than letters, or learning chunks or groups of words rather than individual words. Here, another one mentioned is state-dependent learning. The context or the situation of learning is important to remember the new items because connections are formed not only between the items or experiences, but also between the emotional state or situation the learners are in. Okay, now we can move on to storage. As demonstrated in the chart here by word dive, a new word is perceived through the sensory system and then passes permanently to the brain's long-term memory if it is properly processed in the working memory or short-term memory. As shown in chart 1 and chart 2, Atkinson-Shiffrin model or Badley and Teach model, there are 3 stages for the new information to go to the long-term memory after the new word is perceived through senses. The first one is sensory memory. As demonstrated in the chart here by word dive, a new word is perceived through the sensory system and then passes permanently to the brain's long-term memory if it is properly processed in the working memory. As we said, it is also short-term memory. As shown in chart 1 and chart 2, Atkinson-Shiffrin model or Badley and Hitch model, the stages are the same. The first one is sensory memory and the working memory or short-term memory and long-term memory. When we first see or hear a new word, this perception of incoming information enters through our sensory memory. It can only hold information for less than a second, in fact, just enough to move the information to working memory, which is considered the primary component of language processing and learning. It controls the information coming from the sensory system and processes it for long-term storage. It also retrieves information from long-term memory. However, its duration and capacity are limited. It can only hold material for about 20 seconds and no more than roughly 7 items at a time. Long-term memory, in turn, has unlimited capacity. It contains all our knowledge and is much more stable than working or short-term memory. If a piece of information is successfully transferred to long-term memory, it will be remembered for a long time. Learning how new information can be stored effectively will again enhance effective learning and retention of target language, but it is important to highlight the following key points as well. Research has shown that memories are not stored in our brains like books. When a lexical item is stored in long-term memory, the brain does not place it in just any random place along our neural networks. The neural connections between the lexical items in our mental lexicon are determined by specific mechanisms, which involve the physical aspect of a word, as well as the metalinguistic, semantic, sociolinguistic, and emotional domains. Therefore, helping create these connections is related to deep thinking, personalization, and strategies that are preferred and effective for the individuals. For example, how new vocabulary will be recorded in a journal and what kind of strategies will be useful in a completely individual task is a very personal thing. Teachers may encourage some of them and introduce effective methods, but how it is done is the learner's responsibility. Let's continue with question 3. Please complete this sentence. Working or short-term memory works as a waiting room of memory. It controls the information coming from sensory system and processes it for long-term storage. Let's move on to the retention part. Retention or retrieval is the process of re-accessing information from the past, which has been encoded and stored. Retention occurs through recognition or recall. Therefore, recycling of the target language through recognition by using different kinds of activities like true, false, and multiple choice questions, or through different kinds of recall, such as remembering a fact or a situation that requires the direct uncovering of information from memory, are quite different. Recognition is simpler because it requires only one process, a simple familiarity decision. A full recall is more complicated than recognition for the memory because it requires not only the retrieval of several items from memory, but also choosing the correct information from the items retrieved. In order to retrieve a word successfully, two factors become important. The strength of the memory trace, how often we have processed that word, the use of an effective cue which enables working memory to find that information in the brain. Successful recall depends on the number of connections a word has with previously stored information in long-term memory. That's why it may be useful to look at the forgetting curve carefully. The forgetting curve you see here shows the decline of memory retention in time. In other words, how information is lost over time when there is no attempt to retain it. Unfortunately, it is estimated that 80% of material is lost within 24 hours of initial learning. We all know from experience that most of forgetting happens right after the end of a lesson. But the bad news isn't only related to the speed of forgetting. Despite the decreased pace of forgetting after the first major loss, the fact is that words stored in the long-term memory are also forgotten. What is important here is words that are only known in a receptive manner are logically more easily forgotten. In session 2, we try to make a difference between receptive and productive memory and try to focus on learning vocabulary for productive purposes. So here we need to look at the question related to this. Please answer this question now. Question 4. Yes, 80% of the words are forgotten right after the classroom. So what are the implications for this? You may want to make notes in your notebook, of course. Revisit, recycle, and revise. Make students work for it. That is guided discovery, personalization, and associating that word with the previously known vocabulary. This helps develop their cognitive abilities better than just translating it into their mother tongue in vocabulary journals. So personalization here is a greater student investment, and we want to remember that at all times. So thank you for this part. Please continue with chapter 2, the role of forgetting in vocabulary learning.